In this episode, the featured film takes the viewer back to the Depression of the difficult decade of the 1930s, locates the story in the exotic Deep South of the United States, and demonstrates yet again the incredible movie-making period between 1970 and 1975. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Hard Times was released in 1975. This movie is a period piece as it takes place in about the middle of the 1930s decade. The setting is the southern U.S., specifically New Orleans, Louisiana. Now the title suggests that this was a hard time, and certainly the decade of the 30s was a very difficult time for most of the Western world, and especially the United States. Well, in the last 200 years, it's not wrong to say that any period can be a difficult period. The last 200 years being what I consider the modern age for people like us. But of course, some periods are more difficult than others. In fact, in 1854, Victorian novelist Charles Dickens published a book called Hard Times, describing another very difficult period in Western history, in this case British history. So, and we have had the American Civil War, 2 world wars, so there's been a lot of difficult periods in the last 200 years. Our story looks at the very, very challenging decade of the 1930s. The problem of the 1930s actually began on October 29th, 1929, when the stock market crashed. Well, you can look it up, and there's lots of reasons why that crash led to incredible economic problems in all of the Western world, and certainly the major one was job loss. The unemployment rates through most of the 1930s were incredibly high, 5 times higher than today's typical unemployment rates, and that caused undue suffering in this decade from 1930 right up until 1939. The other element was, in the United States, there was some climate problems, and there were crop failures, and there was something known as the Dust Bowl, which was a failure of crops and the high winds of many storms that blew this relatively good topsoil all over the place, such that the farmers could no longer farm. So it was sort of like, I guess, a perfect storm, where you had high unemployment and then the failure of farmers to make a living. So it's a very, very difficult period. It didn't help, arguably, that right up until 1933, it was illegal to sell alcohol in the United States. Not in Canada, not in Mexico, not in Central or South America, and certainly not Europe, but in the United States, it was illegal to sell alcohol. You could drink it, but you couldn't go out and buy it, and you couldn't go to a pub or any other institution and get it. That ended in 1933, and also there was a change of presidents when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, I believe, in 1933, the election of 1932. And over the course of a few years, he instituted many programs designed to get more people back to work. And there's a very rich history and documentaries about this. And it did help a tremendous amount, but still they were very, very difficult times. And the unemployment rate stayed high, and the ability to make a living for the average person was extremely difficult. What would happen was you either stayed where you were and found a way to eke out a living, or you would be on the move. Families would pack up, walk away from their homes or their farms. The banks would take over the land, take over the properties, foreclose on them because the people couldn't afford to pay their mortgages, and they would start moving west, anywhere where they felt like they could make a living. Because no matter how difficult these times were, and they were very difficult, people get up in the morning, they have to feed their kids, feed themselves, and they somehow have to find a way to make a living. And in fact, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, towns would erect signs at the city limits saying, "Keep moving, no work in our town." So it was an extremely difficult period, and it lasted so long. I don't know what it must have been like to live in those days. People were on the move. They eventually ended up on the West Coast in California because the land ended at the Pacific Ocean. And so they tried to get work there, or the weather was it was warm, and so it was easier to live in California where you wouldn't freeze to death. But it doesn't necessarily mean there were a lot of jobs. It was what it was. The average person, family, they tried to make a living. Men were on the move. Families may or may not have been on the move. And it was a time when trying to do anything possible to make a living was what mattered. In fact, on my mother's side, my maternal grandmother lived in Canada. I don't believe we were as hard hit as the deep south of the U.S., but it was still a very, very difficult time. She was a widow, and she raised 7 kids. She was a school teacher, and her house became a boarding house, which was very, very common in this period. And there was probably an element of people helping out everybody because it was a very difficult time. So I really appreciate the fact that my grandmother raised my mother and my aunts and uncles during this very, very difficult period. So what was the average person to do in the United States? There were 2 roads. You would try to do whatever you could to make a living, and there were 2 ways to do that. One was honestly, and one was outside the law. And the 1930s is rich in stories, deserved and undeserved, of outlaws. It was the time of big cars with V8 engines. People would travel wherever they needed to go, either to try to find work or to take up a hobby like robbing banks. And hence we had the birth of some very notorious people, mostly men. I think perhaps the most famous would have been John Dillinger, a very successful bank robber who also was arrested a couple of times and escaped from prison. They were made larger than life by the press, who were looking for stories to entertain people because people needed to be entertained. Some of the popularity might have been deserved, others not. I think of Bonnie and Clyde. History has shown us that they were 2 stone-cold killers, and I'm not so sure they deserve the accolades they received over the years, and a very favorable movie made about them in the late 60s. Other characters had funny names like Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, and on and on and on. And so Hollywood made films during this period, identifying the difficulties of the period. A lot of films to distract the viewers from the everyday life. So they made musicals, they made very fluffy material, as I've talked about in earlier episodes, wonderful films, enjoyable films. They also made some hard-hitting films about the time, and there were no shortage of gangster films. Lots and lots of gangster films. They were very popular. It wasn't until 1939 when war broke out in Europe, not the U.S. The U.S. did not get involved in the Second World War until 1941. But in 1939, when war broke out, there is a need for the machines of war. And so the U.S., which was an economic powerhouse despite this depression, now had the opportunity to make the machines of war. And so people started getting jobs, and the depression more or less ended, or unemployment went down rapidly after 1939, when there was factory work to make airplanes, tanks, artillery, cannons, you name it, in many, many states. And also the drought and the Dust Bowl of the 30s was over with. So things just turned around, sadly, because of a world war after September of 1939. So if we look beyond the outlaws, the average person just tried to do what they could to make a living. For women, this might involve very menial work and, of course, a rise in prostitution. For the men, it would be either being outlaws or finding work wherever they could. And it was not unusual for the men to leave their families because they couldn't support them anyways and travel around looking for work. Their means of travel was very iconic for this period, and that was by train. Now that wasn't by passenger train, it was by freight trains. The men would get onto freight trains just outside the depots so that they couldn't be kicked off the trains and travel around. And when they got to another town, they would jump off the train before the train went into the depot. They were called hobos. So that was the period. That was the difficulty of the times. And it showed that people still tried to make a living and live from day to day. There's probably very few times in the history of many countries where the populace has a blind trust or a very positive feeling about institutions and government. I think it was probably true after the Second World War, after 1945 to maybe 1960, when it was proved that Western democracies defeated Germany in the Second World War. The government and the army and all the powers of institutions had done a lot of positive things to end that war. So there might have been a good feeling about governments and institutions during that time. But this certainly wasn't the case in the 30s. Banks were despised. Any financial institution was despised. Government people were looked upon with skepticism, to say the least. Government people would represent the taking of land, even with the banks taking of property. In the early 30s, very little was done to help the populace. It was just, well, that's the market, that's the way economies work, and sooner or later it's going to change and you just have to hang in there. So that didn't sit very well with people. So there was a hatred of police, who were the instruments of institutions in government. There was a hatred of banks. And so basically it was everybody's on their own, and you did whatever you could to get by. So the 30s were a treasure trove of information to tell stories about. Novelists wrote about the times. Movie makers have made movies for decades and decades about these very difficult times, about the kind of people that it generated, the outlaw or the tough person who somehow made it through. Our story is set in the Deep South, and specifically New Orleans, Louisiana, a very exotic locale. Exotic for two reasons. First of all, from what anybody knows about New Orleans, it is probably the most unique city in the United States, partly because it has a huge French and Caribbean influence. Napoleon, 100 years before the time of this film, or so, give or take 10 years, sold Louisiana to the United States. So there was a huge French element to Louisiana, which remains to this day. And secondly, by the 1930s, New Orleans was the birthplace of jazz, was famous for food, specifically gumbo and oysters. There's a lot about oysters in this film, and I will say that I have never had an oyster, though I know they exist. I've seen them. It's just not my thing, but the movie very early on shows us some oysters, and it's kind of cool. And so we have an exotic backdrop to our story. And New Orleans has kept that exotic element right to the present day. Places like the Café du Monde, famous for donuts, the music of New Orleans, the jazz music and more, the funeral processions that are very vigorous and full of music, the above ground cemeteries, not only their tourist traps like I believe Bourbon Street. I have a friend who lives part of the year in New Orleans and just loves the town. So it's a great place to set a story about this very difficult time. Which brings us to our story. Hard Times is about some period, let's say mid-1930s. And the story shows how people try to make a living during this period. The movie opens in a very iconic way, which is quite typical of the period, and it's a train pulling into the city. Now, we don't know that it's coming into New Orleans. We just see the train moving along and eventually it stops. And on that train is our hero, Chaney. Chaney by himself, very tough looking dude, standing at the open door of the freight car, watching the world go by. The assumption is he's coming to yet another city to try to make a few bucks or as much money as he can. He ends up coming into the city, and so the powers that be need to set the story up relatively quickly, because this is not a long film, under 2 hours, and it really has to tell a great story in a very short period of time. So it has to be tight. So very early on in the film, we see our hobo, sort of, very tough looking guy. The actor who plays Chaney was a tough guy. Comes into town in a diner, and he notices across the street that there's a lot of activity. And even in this diner, where prices, of course, in these days were very cheap, but finding a nickel or a dime was as hard to come by then as it is finding a few bucks today. They have a nice little sequence where it emphasizes the fact that even a nickel is a lot of money in those days, relatively speaking. He sees some activity and goes across the street and sees a bunch of men getting together. Now, there was a lot of maybe illegal activity, but not that illegal activity. Things like gambling, things like what were called street fights or pickup fights. And this is where men, big strong men, relatively, would bare knuckle fight, and there would be bets made on these men, and that's how they made a living. If you were a laborer or a tough guy and out of work, well, you got involved in these street fights or bare knuckle fights inside, usually inside a building. It wasn't out on the street, and you would punch away till somebody dropped, with very few rules, no referees. And this is how they would make a living. We see a promoter, we see a manager of one of these fighters, and this is our other star of the film. And Chaney, our hero, takes a really close look at this fellow, watches the events, and figures that maybe this is a way he can make some money in this town. And that's our setup for the story. Very quickly, our manager, whose nickname is Speed. Everybody sort of has a street name. His name is Speed, and he finds himself in a restaurant similar to the diner, and he's ordering oysters on the half shell, as they say, with a squeeze of lemon. So again, we're getting a feel for this backdrop of New Orleans, Louisiana. And he turns around from the counter where he picks up 6 more, and there's Chaney sitting at the table, and he introduces him to Speed, and the story begins. He's apparently a fighter as well, or he thinks he can make some money fighting. Speed is not convinced at all, because he's probably gone through many fighters. He knows that times are tough, and if you can throw a punch, maybe you can make money, maybe you can't make money. So he is anything but impressed, and he says, okay, I'll set up the next fight. Chaney says he doesn't have much money, he'll bet on himself, and away we go. So as it turns out, there are many, many players involved in this game of gambling. There's lots of gambling. There's poker, there's craps, and there's gambling on not only boxing, but cockfights. I don't know how that became popular, but putting 2 roosters into a very enclosed pen and betting on who's going to beat the other one. But all of that was taking place in this time. There's managers, there's promoters, there's big money guys who might have a lot of money, but they just enjoy the idea of gambling on people, boxing, and seeing somebody beat the crap out of somebody. So our characters are set up, and our story progresses. We see other things. We see the world of New Orleans. We see that there are a lot of people doing very menial things to make a living, a lot of shoe shine people. And there's also the underworld of New Orleans, which is the world of money, of course, and that is the loan sharking world. If money is hard to come by, well, you can borrow it. You can always borrow money. And of course, the loan sharks loan out money with incredibly high interest rates. Surprise, surprise. And you can get into trouble if you don't pay them back when they want to be paid back. This is all part of the fabric of a very tough time when people did whatever they could to get some money. Eventually they pay the money back, or if they didn't pay it back in time, they'd get beat up pretty bad. Not murdered, because dead people don't pay back debts. And so our hero, one of our heroes, Speed, he has a lot of trouble with these guys because he's living a relatively decent lifestyle. So we might assume that he's done okay in the past, or he's managed to get by at a quality of life that might be higher than others, but he's still into debt to these loan sharks. And our hero Chaney, well, he goes out and he eats in between fights, and he wants to. He is definitely self-contained. He's completely lives within himself, but at the same time, he wants companionship. I guess he's looking for someone, and he meets a woman in a diner. He buys her a cup of coffee. She's a very, very tough woman, as any single woman or a woman on their own without a husband or a family would have been in these days, and they strike up a relationship. And this is a critical element to the film because it sort of shows that there's another side to Chaney, but it also shows the plight of women during this time. It was not an easy time to get by if you were on your own. The world of prostitution was always beckoning, the money that could be made, and in a town like New Orleans that had a long history of such things, of brothels and madams and things like that, well, it wasn't any surprise that a lot of women on their own would gravitate towards these places because they had to live. They had to make a living however way they could. So that's another element to our story. The spine of the story is a very wealthy man in town likes to have the best street fighter under his control. Well, what if somebody beats that street fighter? He doesn't like it. So the story is, how good is our hero Chaney? Is he the best fighter? Can he beat the number one guy? Or is he just going to be more just another loser, and Speed has to find another fighter? The wealthy guy who has the best fighter enjoys making these setting up these bare knuckle fights. It's just something he likes to do. He likes to gamble. This is what turns him on. There's another scene that again gives us the flavor of New Orleans and its parishes, and not provinces or districts. They were called parishes, where in order to get some fights before the big fight against the best fighter, they got to fight in various places. And so they go outside of New Orleans to a local area to fight some or a fight that's staged by some rather nasty people who you don't really trust too much. And there's a great scene about how that unfolds. We learn pretty quickly that our hero Chaney is a pretty good fighter, even though the actor and the character was not young. The actor who portrayed Chaney was actually 54 years old at the time, but in the movie, this character is definitely not in his 20s or 30s, and so he's seen to be a pushover until they find out he's a really good fighter. So that's just another scene that adds some flavor to the film, that shows us what our character Chaney is all about. It adds more depth to this character, and they go on a nice little road trip and have some fun, which all builds up to the big fight between the best fighter in New Orleans versus our newcomer Chaney. And that's where the story takes off. That's where there are ups and downs. Speed is in trouble with the money he's borrowed in order to get his fighter into this fight. It's very threatening, and that's the world of hard times. So Chaney is portrayed by an actor named Charles Bronson, who in the 1970s was an international star. He began his career, I think, in the late 50s, but certainly he made 2 movies in the early 60s that brought him to the attention of the movie-going world. In 1960, he was one of the 7 of the Magnificent Seven, a terrific film, by the way. It's one of my favorite films, and I'll talk about it in a later episode, and has a really nice role in that movie. A couple of years later, he makes another enormous film. He's a minor character, but a critical character in a movie called The Great Escape. And so he was just working nonstop. If you look it up, you see all these credits that he had between the late 50s and right through the 60s, working away, but wasn't really a huge star, but he was a bankable actor. And then in the late 60s, he made a couple of films. He was had a critical role in a film called The Dirty Dozen, a very well-regarded film, a film I like very much, about a Second World War film. But then he made a film in the late 60s called Once Upon a Time in the West, which was a film made by Italian director Sergio Leone, and that made him an international star because, you know, a film about the Western U.S. but made in Italy, so the European movie-going public would want to see this film. It was a big hit all over the world, one of my favorite Westerns. I like it very, very much, but it made Bronson an international star. So that throughout the 70s, he made so many movies. A lot of them I'm not a big fan of, but some of them I liked very much. So when he came to Hard Times, he was a megastar. And looked the part, tough as nails, that squint of a guy who's been around a lot. If you look it up, there's actors who say Bronson was tougher than anybody on the set of the movie, and but he was a chain smoker, so even though he could outpunch anybody, he didn't have a lot of wind, but he was he just looked like a guy trying to make a living any way he could, and he had in his back pocket this skill that he could use in any town he was in, which was as an elite bare knuckle fighter. Actually, saw Charles Bronson in person in the early 1980s. I was a young buck working in a retail store, and one day he walked in. He was in Toronto for whatever reason, and I looked up and I thought, oh my God, that's Charles Bronson. He didn't say a word. He was a very quiet guy, even in Hard Times. There's not a lot of dialogue, reminiscent of Steve McQueen. He didn't like a lot of dialogue, and he didn't have a lot of dialogue. And he walked in the store, looked around, and walked out. But he was Charles Bronson. I was just, my jaw dropped. It was pretty incredible. The other main actor in this film is who plays Speed, a fellow by the name of James Coburn. He was a very bankable actor. I wouldn't say he was a megastar, but he did very well in the 60s and 70s. And coincidentally, he was one of the seven in The Magnificent Seven alongside Charles Bronson, and he was also in The Great Escape. So he was a very recognizable face, made a lot of movies in the 60s and 70s, and ended up, I thought, being perfectly cast for this role of Speed in Hard Times. He was also in a movie I liked very much, made around this time, called The Last of Sheila, a film I hope to talk about in a later episode. So Coburn was a bankable star, recognizable to any of the movie-going public, and I thought did a tremendous job playing Speed in this film. He wasn't a nasty guy, he was a victim, but he was street smart like everybody in this movie is. Everybody's street smart. They know the rules, they know the score, they know what happens if you don't pay back the money, but he wanted to live a good lifestyle. So he and Chaney develop a rapport. Chaney trusts him, likes him. They have some conflict later on in the movie, but as I said, he made a lot of good films, and a lot of films I like, and I think he was a terrific actor. Now, the period between 1930 and 2000, those years of movie making, which I focus on in this series, there were some legends, actors who became legends, actors who became megastars, but there weren't a lot of them. I haven't done a tally, but there was, of course, more than one and less than 100, less than 50, maybe even less than a couple of dozen who were either legends of the screen or superstars. There were lots of good actors, lots of good leading men and women, had terrific careers and participated in some terrific movies. But in that same period, there were hundreds and hundreds of supporting players, terrific actors and actresses who either had not co-starring roles, but secondary roles and minor roles. And these are the actors that I have a tremendous affection for, because they would have resumes, they would have made 50, 60, 100 films over their careers, just taking whatever job they could get. They weren't the kind of stars who could dictate what they could and couldn't do, what director would direct them. Their agents would say, I got a job for you, they took it. and they became recognizable to the movie-going public. It was really welcoming to see these guys in minor roles, and there are literally hundreds of these men and women between 1930 and 2000 who did a tremendous job in these films, and their performances in these films, however short or however modest they were, really added to the fabric and the overall success of these movies, because they were good at what they did. They were characters, they were unique, they were all good looking. Every actor, I think, male or female, were good looking in their own way. Even the hard, tough as nails, ugly ones were good looking. They had screen presence. And in our film, Hard Times, there is such an actor, and his name has a really cool name, Strother Martin Jr. I did a little look-up about this guy because I've seen him in several movies that I like very much. And it turns out when he was a young man, he qualified as an Olympic diver. He was an excellent swimmer. Somehow he made his way to Hollywood, and he got involved in training after he got out of the Second World War, where he trained Navy men how to swim. He got involved with movies and training people how to stars to swim. And then he started playing in bit roles. Now he is a very unique character. He has a very distinctive look about him. He looks quite short, but apparently he was very, very strong. And he was in many, many films in the 60s and 70s. In fact, he's already appeared in one of the movies I've talked about, which was The Wild Bunch. He plays a particularly nasty lowlife in the posse chasing our wild bunch. But he also was in a movie called Cool Hand Luke. Has a very famous scene in that film. And on and on. He did many films in the 60s and 70s, and I just think he's a terrific actor, and I think he is typical of the hundreds and hundreds of actors and actresses who performed over this 70-year period that were critical, I think, to creating depth to these films, creating characters that were not scene stealers, but were unmistakable, that added either comedy, humor, or nastiness, and deserve as much attention as can possibly be given to them. Their job was to keep working. I think, my personal view is, I think most actors and actresses, once they reach a certain level, they want to work, whether it's in a play, whether it's in a movie, whether it's on television, whether it's in a program. They just want to keep working, partly to make a living, partly to build up a career. But if you go into the very, very difficult world of acting, and I believe it is an incredibly difficult world, you do it because you want to get in either on the stage or in front of a camera and do your thing. And the superstar, the legends, they had tremendous control over what they did, who was their director, who they wanted to work with and not work with, what scripts they would accept and what scripts they wouldn't accept. But that's a story unto itself. But for these hundreds of character actors, their job was to find work and do whatever they could to keep their career going and never say no to any part. So I really like the fact that Strother Martin, who plays Poe, and he is sort of a corner man for our boxer Chaney. He has a great little scene about being in medical school for a couple of years but had to leave. Very sympathetic character. Has a real nice southern drawl to how he speaks. Has an affection for gospel music. And just, again, adds color and depth to a film where they didn't need to add that color and depth. And that's why I always like films like Hard Times, because they go the extra mile. They take an extra step and say, we got a couple of characters on the sidelines here. They're just filling up space. They're just taking up space. We don't need to do too much with them. Or they decide to cast actors and actresses who are going to make a difference and really add some oomph to the picture. It just so happens, and it doesn't matter too much, that the woman that our hero Chaney spent some time with over the course of the film, Charles Bronson's wife in real life, was actually this actress. Her name was Jill Ireland, and she does a very nice job, I think, of being this tough as nails, on your own, trying to survive, street smart, don't give me any guff, woman who meets up with Chaney in this movie. And so I think Hard Times has all the things about it I like. A very tight script, an incredible leading man in Chaney and Charles Bronson, who you can't take your eyes off him, which is typical of any great star. Really well written story, good pacing. The exotic world of New Orleans. I've never been to the city. I've seen my share of movies about New Orleans. It seems like a wonderful place. You get a glimpse, or more than a glimpse, into a world that many of us know nothing about. They say that New Orleans is unlike any other city in the U.S. because of its French heritage, because of its Caribbean influences, its location right on the Gulf of Mexico. And so I love movies like this where you say, well, maybe it was something like this back then, and even though that's important and secondary to the story, it's still there. And so Hard Times tells a terrific story of what was it like? What was it like in the 30s for some ordinary people trying to make a living, but with a fellow who was extraordinary in the fact that he had a tremendous skill and he could make money in this very hard-edged world of the 1930s Depression. As I go through this series and talk about the movies I like and the movies I like a lot, I've become aware, which I was not really that aware before, of what a terrific period of movie making there was between 1970 and 1975. I've already looked at a few pictures from this period, and there are going to be more, and I am amazed at two things, as I've mentioned earlier. One is that the period pieces made in these 5 years were just exceptional, in my opinion. They stand up today. They look terrific. They're intelligent films. Why was this period so strong with these period pictures as opposed to the early middle 60s or after 1975 or the 80s, when I don't recall too many films that approached in any way the terrific films of this period. Period pieces such as Hard Times, Chinatown, The Two Godfathers, The Sting, the war movie Patton, Cabaret, and I could go on and on and on. The more I look at this period and think about the films I want to talk about, there's many more lining up ready to go, and they were all made in this 5-year period. Excellent police films, tough police films, you name it, westerns, terrific westerns. It's just I don't understand why it was such a bountiful period, but it was a bountiful period. And credit to Hollywood, credit to the filmmakers, maybe the people who came up after the invention of television and maybe cut their teeth in the television world and acquired skills that allowed them to make even more profound movies, tighter movies, tougher movies. The technology had improved. Scriptwriters have been plying their trade for decades and started writing terrific films. The new directors on the scene were standing on the shoulders of the people that came before them. 30 years of tremendous movie making, and they just had to make their mark. They had to equal or better those films. It was a wonderful period. And even though I like movies right up till 2000 and beyond, and even though there were many wonderful movies made after this period, I can't think of a period other than perhaps the golden decade of the 1950s, where so many good movies were made in such a short period of time, these 5 years beginning in 1970 and ending in 1975. So I enjoy watching so many of those films. I want to talk about those films in this series, and I just love the fact that I can sit back and watch these movies whenever I want from the 22nd row.